the long course is what you need and you really need to dig in, we're going to do a much deeper dive. But I want you to kind of understand what's the thought process behind designing a building, or why would they use these type of things. Give you a couple of rules of thumb and some ideas that, heck, they'll be helpful. All right. So first off, let's talk about a Psych chart, because a Psych chart is a huge part of the HVAC industry, and a Psych chart is called that because it's a psychrometric. PSYCH for short. All right. Down here you have temp, and here you have moisture. So if you look at a real Psych chart, which if I went and grabbed mine out of my backpack, oh, I put it back, never mind, it's not in my backpack tonight. But I carry around a Psych chart a lot because you need it. And if you looked at it, there'll be like lines going everywhere, and it's kind of crazy. But the most important thing to remember is that temperature increases going that way, and moisture increases going up. And so what this shows you is it helps you understand how a system behaves. And so as you think about a temperature, a dry bulb temperature and a wet bulb temperature. So we will usually do that as a dB, WB, like that. Or sometimes you might see it as a 9578. We'll write it like that. What that means is 95 dry bulb, 78 wet bulb. This is like standard design conditions in Nashville, for instance. So what that means is during a hot summer day, it's going to get up to 95 during the day, and at night it's probably only going to drop to about 78, which is how much moisture will come out of the air. You know how moisture condensates on the outside of a glass when it's cold? So that's what dew is when the temperature drops to a certain point, the moisture will fall out of the air and it'll dew on things. And then the next morning it'll warm back up, and that'll evaporate a little bit. But this is kind of saying this is what your temperature swings are going to be on a hot day. This would be how it ends up kind of humid. So out west, you might end up, and we're in America, I'm in America, and so you might have like 95 during the day, but you might have like 95.50. So 95.50 would be like in the desert where it gets really dry, it gets really cool at night. All the moisture is going to drop out of that air, and so when it heats up the next day, it's going to be a dry heat. You ever hear people say, oh, well, it was hot, but it was dry heat? All right, that's what we're talking about is that difference. Now, if you have a temperature on here, the most important things to remember on a Psych chart are going to be your relative humidity, and that's going to be lines that kind of come up like this, and they're close together, and then they spread out. So let's just call that 50% relative humidity. And what that means is it's about 50% of the amount of moisture that can be held in the air. So this line up here represents 100%, this top of the chart. And so basically if we pick a temperature that we want and we say right here at 50%, let's call it 75 and 50%, we're pretty comfortable right there. But if we go, see, we're not adding any temperature, but we just add a bunch of moisture. So we're in a locker room or something like that. We add a lot of moisture. We go up here to 100% humidity. It's going to feel really clammy. It's going to feel very wet. So until we hit this. So what an air conditioner is going to do, let's just say we start right here. An air conditioner is going to start cooling, right? And cooling will be moving us that direction. So we're going to move over that direction, and we're going to hit this line. When we hit this line, we're just going to slide right down as far as we keep cooling. So if we cool to, let's say, 55 degrees, that's where we are. So our wet bulb temperatures are actually lines that kind of go like this. And 75 here is going to line up with 75 there, and so on. All right, so if we cool it down to 55, and then we put it back into the space, it's going to warm back up. And we kind of do a little cycle. All right? So that's not a comprehensive how the Psych chart works, but I just want you to understand that we've got temperature, we've got moisture, and so the HVAC process is usually interested in not just temperature control, but also humidity control, because a very dry climate can use some different types of equipment, and it also has a much different moisture requirement as far as being sure that the room stays comfortable. If you just control to 75 degrees, but you never pay attention to the humidity, in South Florida, that could be a problem. Whereas out west in California or Colorado or something, it may not be as big of a concern because there's not any moisture there. All right? So dry bulb, wet bulb, there's that. How do we design a building? How do we think about what a building is going to look like or do heat loads? I took an HVAC class in college, and the problem was we did a lot of manual hand calculations to figure out the heat load of a building, and we have software that does a lot of that stuff now. But it is important to understand how those loads are kind of calculated. So basically what you do is you look at the building, you look at the direction and where the sun is throughout the day. And so let's just say this is the west side and this is, no, reverse that, east and west. So the sun rises over here and it goes this way. And so you basically look at throughout the day at different angles. You know, obviously if you got a window on this side, you have sun coming in, so you have a high load from that in the morning. But you don't have a high load from that in the afternoon because you have shade. And so load calculation software is going to look, what's the worst case scenario for this? And that's why sometimes on buildings you'll see like a kind of strange pitched roof. And that'll be, the goal is not only to look cool, but sometimes it'll be to cast shadows or light on a building, or to reduce the load on that. So load calculations are something that we use computers for. Some general rules of thumb. Now rules of thumb can get you in trouble, but let's talk about two of them real quick. And that is 400 square feet per ton. All right, that is an old rule of thumb. That is not necessarily relevant to your building today, but 400 square feet per ton, if your building is 400 square feet, you probably need about a ton of air conditioning. Now, if it's an energy efficient house or building, it could be as high as like 1,200 square feet per ton, something like that. If you are dealing with very hot, very humid air, it could be as low as 100 or 200 square foot per ton. If you're dealing with a greenhouse or something like that, for instance. But 400 square feet per ton is a kind of a rule of thumb that a lot of people pay attention to. Another 400, though, is 400 CFM per ton. So, if you were looking at your house and you're trying to figure out what tonnage of air conditioning you should have, or maybe your air conditioning went out and you're trying to figure that out, if you know the square footage of your house, you can figure out what size unit have you got. A lot of people had issues a number of years ago because they put much bigger units than they needed. They bumped this number down, so they said like 200 square feet per ton will be good. Well, the problem with that is that it kicks on and it cools very quickly, and then it gets the house cool, and then it shuts off. What it doesn't do is it doesn't ride down this curve, and so it doesn't drive anything this way. It doesn't really reduce your moisture, and that ends up with a cold, clammy house. All right, so you might, if you have a cold, clammy house and you realize that your air conditioning cycles a bunch, it's on for like 2 minutes and then it's off for 20, you may have an oversized system. Square foot per ton, CFM per ton. CFM is a big deal in the HVAC industry, and so we're going to talk about that. Tonnage is a way that we calculate loads of an air conditioning, and so that is going to be 12,000, since we're going into these BTU hours. So, ton, 12,000 BTUs, 400 CFM per square 400 CFM per ton. And that's really going to come into play when you're talking with equipment manufacturers. They're the only ones that care about that. Let's talk about equipment now. Should we? Yes.